points. And just before I Just before I respond to them, I would also just say to this gentleman that you were talking about Makalawi, I think. And
not only Makalawi, military camp.
But in Chalama, when you talk about Chalamabet,
yeah, I was talking about Makalawi.
that is when you look at the report, there is a section about Makalawi in there, and it talks about Chalamabet among other issues and the conditions in Makalawi, particularly in the underground section. And there are a number of cases of people we interviewed, including that young man I mentioned who had the business plan in university. He was in the underground he was detained in the underground section of Makalawi. And some of the conditions there, including prolonged handcuffing, chaining, prolonged solitary confinement, might amount to torture, and I believe they do, but that there are various factors under international definitions, but I believe they amount to torture, just the conditions themselves. So that is documented in the report, and you might want to have a look at those sections. Moving on to those questions, I've already forgotten what the first one was, sorry.
The first one was what was
yes, okay, I remember. It's a good question, except that I don't think there's necessarily an answer. I don't know where I'll have to cast my mind back about where I decided that I just had to do this report, and it was partly, one thing that I do remember is that really shocked me was that UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, was starting to question Oromo's stories because they said there hadn't been any documentation of these kinds of violations for such a long time. And so in a meeting, a sort of a general catch-up meeting, I guess, for want of a better description, this was said to me, and I was genuinely shocked that they would even question Oromo's stories. And then I sort of realised that there just wasn't proper documentation of what was going on right now. And there was, maybe it wasn't comprehensive, but there had been documentation in the past, but nothing for really a long time. And so I really felt that there was a need for that to be documented properly. And that's where, when I decided that really we should have a report that was just basically on this kind of, I wasn't entirely sure when I started out exactly everything that would go into it, but I did know the sort of framework that I was trying to document. And then within that, I had occasionally throughout the process had colleagues, colleagues in the human rights field who know about Ethiopia saying, but what particular aspects are you trying to document? And I said everything. And they were saying, but you can't do that, that's impossible. And I believed that everything had to go in it because it's all part of the same picture, and that it's part of the same process and system. And to separate them is to not show properly what the system is. So to have the arrests, but not what happens to people after they're arrested, is only telling a small amount of the story. And that's why the report is as big as it is. And I've been very pleased in the meetings that I've done so far this week in New York and here with the US government, in the response that, a lot of people questioned, even within Amnesty, there were people who were saying, you can't publish a report this big, no one will read it. And that's already been proven wrong to me this week a number of times by people who it's really important that they read it, and they have read it, and that's great. And the people also, and that people take the size of the report as an indication in itself of the seriousness of the situation, which I think is right, and that's how it should be interpreted. I'm very pleased with the reaction that it's had so far in that respect. Your second question about where next, and you were asking in relation to sort of people who are maybe in the diaspora, right, and how to constructively sort of move forward. And it is a really, really difficult question, but I think that there are a few things that can be done. In that, I think there's a really desperate need for efforts to be made in whatever way possible to get information out of Ethiopia. Whilst it's so difficult to document violations within Ethiopia, but everyone here probably has connections still, right, with family members who are at home. Technology advancements now can be used in different ways to facilitate getting information out, and also to focus on just very specific information that can be very, it can be pinpointed. It's good quality in terms of the reliability of the information that's coming out. I think that's something that is would be incredibly useful, that there's a need for, that everyone can contribute to, but also that everyone can exercise or make efforts towards the quality of the information that's coming out, if that makes sense. And then second of all, in terms of activism from here, as I was saying to Hab just before, everyone can be an activist. Everyone here has a congressperson, and if you all go and request a meeting or you all send a letter to your congressperson, that becomes an issue that they have to respond to. And there are structures within the US government that have, where there are responsibilities to have oversight or investigations into where their money is going and who it's supporting in Ethiopia, including language that you might be aware of in an appropriations bill about when money goes to Ethiopia, and certain human rights progress that has to be in place for that money to continue going, and I think arguably is not in place. And so I think there needs to be greater scrutiny of that, and everyone here can be part of that process in pushing their congressperson to push within Congress for there to be greater scrutiny to ensure that the money within the appropriations bill, saying that money cannot go to Ethiopia in ABC circumstances, that's being adhered to.
I'm sorry, I'm speaking ahead of the elders. I couldn't wait to this moment. Everybody wants us to say thank you today. First of all, thank you very much. It wasn't easy. Within the limited access you have done an extraordinary work. I want to applaud that. You have a special place in every Oromo's heart now. And the repression, the victims are not only those included in your report, but all of us. I've been here in US for 4.5 years. Every single day, my thoughts, everything of myself is there in Oromia. We are all victims. So nobody is, I'm sure I can speak for others too, for any Oromo too. We are all victims. So for you choosing to be voice for those voiceless, that will give us courage for all of us. I really thank you very much. You spoke our heart. Keep the hard work. With this, I will promise everything to just with whatever I can, I will stand by you. But equally important, if there is any way you can recommend us to reach out to those intentionally and unintentionally, intentionally or intentionally, are turning their eyes blind and their ears deaf, if there is any way we can reach out to them, like the medias, it could be medias or it could be different international organizations, any party that can help. The Oromos should find their own answers, but this is a great help. This is really a great help. So thank you very much. Just forever.
You raised your hand first, I'll come to you, DJ. Go ahead.
First of all, I would like to thank you very much for such a great job. Evidently, by any means, like international human rights watch or whatever, this is just not the only human rights abuse have been done in Ethiopia, even on Oromo people, but this one is different in that you specifically work it out on Oromo issue. which is just needed to be focused as a Horn of Africa, as Oromo is the first largest population nation. That means if the Oromo population, the Oromo nation problem is solved, most probably the disturbance of the problem around the Horn of Africa might be solved. Thank you for doing that. And I would like to give you advice, like a piece of advice, that as we Oromo are just very satisfied and just you touched our head, there might be a people of Ethiopia who don't like satellite voice, not to be heard on international media as it was done already, like on The Guardians, on BBC, on Telegraph. Even though they are Ethiopians, but we are just Ethiopians in a quotation. You know, they are Ethiopian people who call themselves Ethiopians, but they don't like Oromo issue to be boarded out to on international arenas, as some Ethiopians did to Oromo activists like Jawar Muhammad, stuff like that. I hope you're gonna get some recommendation or comment on your report that saying, you know, downplaying your job, stuff like that. So you don't have to discourage with that. And thirdly, I would like to, you say in your report, just you recommended Ethiopian people that just the way he gonna solve the Oromo issues. But these have been done for a long time or period, but he didn't do nothing, just even, you remember, just I guess 2008 or something, Bakale Garba and the Urbana Lisa was the guy who just detained or just thrown to the prison because they talked to you guys or international human rights workers. Still, they are serving prisoners. Nothing was done. I mean, your recommendation is not going to be, you know, put in practical. So, is there any way you can just bring these issues to International Court of Justice or ICCs? You know, your report is already, you know, reported using just every documented just practically. Those people just were showing me just even the torture on the scar on their body, everything. Just that's practical, which may help you out to bring that to International Court of Justice. So, in short, is there any way that you or your organization is working on such issue to be brought, to be bring to the International Court of Justice so that something have to be done internationally? That's my question, and thank you very much once again.
Should I take this? Okay, I think there's a very good points, and I'll try to respond to them. And there were a couple of other things that I thought as well while we're going along. So I might just make a couple of other comments and then come to responding to your question. I realised in relation to what you were saying and a couple of other comments that I don't think I very well explained at the beginning why in the analysis of the report, why the Oromo were particularly targeted in that generalised hostility to dissent, which does affect the whole country, and some of it, you know, is well known and some of it is less well known. And the analysis that we have concluded is that it's due to a number of factors, but first of all, particularly the size of the Oromo as a group, because of course they're the biggest group by quite some margin. Secondly, because of the quite strong sense of identity among the Oromo as a group, which can act as a unifying factor, and also because of, I think, a historical perception on the part of the government that the Oromo don't support the government, the EPRDF. That of course the OLF at the time that the transitional government came into power had much wider popular support than the OPDO did, well, which was created at that time, so it didn't have that popular support base, and I think the government has always retained that sort of understanding that there wasn't a big support base within Oromia. And then the opposite of that among the Oromo there's a sort of historical held sense that the government did not represent them and was hostile to or making efforts to marginalise, discriminate or persecute the Oromo. And so I think it's those three factors, and therefore the possibility that if they combine this, the Oromo were organised, they would pose a potentially very significant political threat to the government. And the government is hostile to any political threat at all. It's just that it's potentially more potent from the Oromo as a group and from Oromia as a region, and that's why signs of dissent are looked for, with a sort of hawkish approach and preemptively suppressed in Oromia. So that was the basis where we were starting from. And another point that I thought I should just talk about a bit more, again, sorry, forgive me before I'm coming to your question, but hopefully it's all part of the process, is that what I was saying in response to the question about where we go next and the language in the appropriations bill is not to, attack the aid that's going to Ethiopia, because first of all, there is definitely great need in Ethiopia. Secondly, as Amnesty International, we don't have any position on giving or withholding aid or conditionality of aid unless it's directly funding human rights violations, and then we do have a position on withholding that. But not just to sort of attack the aid or the people who are benefiting, if and where they are benefiting, and the people who are giving it, but to use that as an entry point. Because as Amnesty International, we're not against any government. We always work with where we can and where we have relations with the government, we work with whatever government is in place, because they're the ones who have the ability to protect and observe and respect human rights, the human rights of their citizens. So it has to always be that, whichever government is there has to be responsible for observing human rights. And so looking at those aid channels is an entry point to trying to start to address the violations. That if there are violations happening within the military, or that there's torture happening within the police service, which there is, then that can be addressed with through the sorts of aid, capacity building, funding, training that donors try to give. The significant obstacle to that happening in Ethiopia is political will. So the government doesn't want those things to be addressed. It's part of the system, and the response of the government to this report has been, at least publicly, has been blanket denial. And that doesn't give you a starting point. If there's an acknowledgement of issues within the system, of institutional weakness, of lack of capacity, that sort of thing, then that's a starting point that people who give technical assistance, funding assistance, training can start with. It is a huge challenge that the response of the government is a blanket denial, and that doesn't give partners of the Ethiopian government a starting point to work with. But we hope that at least donors pursuing those lines is at least one of very few entry points that are available. Going to your question at the back, I am conscious of those issues and those divisions, and I think part of that, and I don't want to comment particularly on the ethnic politics of this, but I do believe that partly there is a lack of understanding or awareness of the violations that are happening in Oromia among other groups, but also of violations that are happening in other parts of the country, because it is, in part at least, within the same system of major obstacles to documenting of violations, to reporting on violations, to free exchange of information inside Ethiopia. So I do think that there are other groups who don't know what is happening in Oromia. And that's some of it may be the sort of political situations that you were talking about, but some of it is also just part of the restrictions on freedom of expression and freedom of information within Ethiopia. And more widely, and it's the same with everyone. The donors who are based in Ethiopia really don't have a wider understanding of how bad the human rights situation is. The countries that have bilateral relations, it's the same thing. And hopefully one of the things that we wanted to achieve with this report was demonstrating the the scale of the repression. There are some cases that are quite well known now of journalists, of opposition political party members, particularly who've been prosecuted under the anti-terror legislation. And I think those kinds of cases have, partly through our work and other human rights organisations' work, are now better known. There's a wider awareness of them. But I do know that some important stakeholders, such as some of the donors working with Ethiopia based in Addis, think that that's the extent of it. That there's maybe a handful of cases of journalists and opposition members who were in detention. Yes, they were unjustly imprisoned under the anti-terrorism legislation, but it's a small number of people who are affected. One of the things we wanted to achieve with this report is saying, no, that's just the tiny, tiny tip of the iceberg. Look at the scale of the repression that's happening in other parts of the country, and here focusing particularly on Oromia. And again, we use this figure of at least 5,000 people in the last 3 years. And so I hope that this can contribute to a much deeper understanding of the scale and the pervasiveness of that repression across the country. In relation to your question about where does it go from here, in terms of taking it to a higher level, that is, we hope to, among other things, to demonstrate the seriousness that we accord to the situation by the fact that we included that recommendation to the international community that there ought to be an international commission of inquiry or a similar mechanism at the level we suggested jointly between the UN and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. And I think that's the first stage, certainly, that if something like that could happen, again, it's part of showing the scale of the repression, the scale of the violations and the severity of the violations. The obstacle to that happening will be access. That it's very likely, if there was some sort of initiative from some of what are called the human rights mechanisms of the Human Rights Council, for example, the Special Rapporteur on Torture, who looks at the situation and issues of torture around the world, who is very interested in looking at Ethiopia, and he wants to go to Ethiopia, but he has to be invited by the government of Ethiopia. And so he put in a request, or that office put in a request for an invitation to Ethiopia 9 years ago that still hasn't been responded to. And he's renewed that request, and he's still very interested now. The person who's in the office now is very interested in Ethiopia, but he cannot go without the Ethiopian government saying so. So that's the major obstruction to investigations. But we hope to explore and look at what's possible, and we hope that others can put pressure on the Ethiopian government to allow some sort of a mechanism in. The response of the government saying that everything is great, all of this is totally baseless, and none of this happens. If they want to actually prove that, the way to prove it is to let independent investigators into Ethiopia, which of course, now that almost no independent human rights monitors or investigators can go in any capacity. So to let people into the country, let them into the detention centres, because no one has access to detention centres who publicly documents violations currently. That's not happening. So, there's an easy win if they want to prove, if the government wants to prove that everything is great.
Okay, more questions. I'll come to you. There are people. Jim, you and you. Okay. Jim, I forgot.
Previous speaker's commendation of you. I tried to read the report. I haven't finished the whole thing. It's a horrendous report. So thank you for the indulgence and perseverance to write such huge report. For the Oromo people, successive Ethiopian regime has committed unbelievable atrocities. I don't know if you're from England or from Britain or Ireland, from your accent. But there was a man in the 1840s. His name was William Harris. He wrote a book called The Ethiopian Highlands. And he was following one of the emperors, namely Sahle Selassie of Shah, when he goes out into the Oromo savannas and just massacres peasants and and also plunders their properties and their livestock and so on and so on and so forth. And then his grandson, Menelik, was also committed unbelievable level of atrocities, not only against the Oromos, but also other southern people, you know, the Hadiyas and Kambadas and so on and so forth. So this sort of atrocity by Ethiopian government, in this case by the people who are in power right now, but they have a short memory because they were subjected to similar kind of a criminal act by Dirk, and then perhaps even during Haile Selassie's time. But it's unfortunate. So thank you very much for your well done work. I just wanted to piggyback on the young man's question of the about a month or so ago, the UN Human Rights Rapporteur was in Korea, North Korea actually, and North Korea was just bristling for when he said he's going to bring these human rights violations of the North Korean to the UN, or you know, I don't know other. So why can't the UN, the Human Rights Commission, undertake this kind of reports and
Yeah.
thanks.
Amnesty International, thank you very much for, even though you are late, something sensible. And I thank you personally for your dedication to address this issue. I'm one of the victims, like that brother said. I was one of the victims. I've been in jail for 2 years during Mengistu time, and I was been sentenced to death. This brother here said exactly what I was about to say. This is Ethiopian culture, political culture, to eliminate and destroy the opposition of any kind. Contrary to the Oromo situation, we were very civilized people. We had a Gada system that was very dialogue and debating situation. So these two contrary situations cannot match together. And Ethiopians never learn from the past. They never learn from the past. They are the ones who destroy and destruct their empire. So Amnesty International must be responsible for ignoring certain very critical abuse. For example, you guys, you have to address the issue of Western world donations. Western world donations is killing the Oromo people, jailing the Oromo people. In 1992, this guy's government came, stabilization and the rehabilitation. And I went there and I told them, I asked them, are you taking the money for yourself for democratization, or you are giving to all Ethiopian, so-called Ethiopian people to be democratized, organized? They rejected, but what I said was given to me in CD. Look the way you are talking. They wanted me here in America. So what I want Amnesty International is you must address the issue of donations. That is the way. That is the way these people are killing people, jailing people. They don't believe in dialogue. They don't believe in democracy. That is not their political culture. So that is one thing. The other thing I want to talk to the Oromo people in here and as well as outside is you must be organized. Unless you are organized, there is no way you cannot be heard. So today, Amnesty International has come out and said this is what the Oromos are in, it is going worst on the Oromo people. You must be organized. You must come out and say straight to the point. So I really appreciate Amnesty International, but please try to suggest to your boss the issue of donations. Western donation is the killing of the Oromo people.
Yeah.
Tony?
Yes.
Kapito Tony? Tony? Kapito.